the Jewish sound around and about with your walking Jewish encyclopedia, Isaac Resnick, only on 20 Chai. Welcome, good afternoon. Your host Isaac Resnick. Slightly overcast in Johannesburg. They predict rain. Of course, we're now in the middle of autumn and soon we'll be coming into a winter. Now this afternoon I have a very, very special guest. I'll introduce you in a few moments. But as usual, we start off with those who passed away during the week. Now, we did not have a round and about last week because, don't forget, was the day after a Yom Tov, and I hope you all had a wonderful Yom Tov, enjoyed the cheesecake and the blintzes. So those who passed away were Morris Creswick, Rose Goldenstein, Stanley Lewis, Stephanie Spielberg, Jonathan Walpert, Ronald Ronnie Raff, I'll come back to that in a moment, Bonita Brand, Francis Bartinsky, Ida Wiener, Marlene Marcus, Marlene Mitchell, Rachel Goodman, Selwyn Hilton Immerman, and Mary Osran. We want to wish all the respective families Chaim Tovim Baruchim and a long life, and may they have no further sorrow. Now I'm going to come back to Ronnie Raff and just mention that a little later in the program I'll be having Hugh Reichlin, a very, very close friend of the late Ronnie Raff, to pay tribute to him. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I have a very special guest. It's my privilege and pleasure to have and welcome Shirley Zar. Good afternoon, Shirley. How are you?
Fine, Isaac. It's a pleasure for me to be here. You know, I'm your number one fan, and I'm delighted to tell you, or to tell your listeners, about Paris in March 2018. I am going to talk to you about this most incredible award, the 20th L'Oreal UNESCO for Women in Science, the award ceremony, which my daughter was one of the recipients, and she invited the whole family to come to Paris for a week for the award ceremony, which was held at the UNESCO building in Paris. Now, I know that Isaac will in fact interview my daughter, Professor Heather Zar, in the future, and she'll tell you about her most incredible contribution to medicine and to science. But one of the things that they kept on mentioning was that she has saved numerous tens of thousands of babies in her particular specialization, which she is a pediatrician whose specialization is pneumonia. She's a pulmonologist, so it's pneumonia and asthma and lung disease. And she, if I just will tell you quickly, I don't want to talk about her because Isaac will interview her and she will tell you exactly what all her research entails and how she got this world recognition. She does have many awards in pediatric pulmonology, but this was really a high. And at the ceremony in the UNESCO building, this is what was stated. Each of the 5 2018 L'Oreal UNESCO for Women in Science Awards laureates has cast her own brilliant light on scientific understanding, attaining great distinction in her field. You will discover during the ceremony these 5 exceptional women scientists of the world. Now, these 5 awards were Heather, my daughter. She was the laureate for Africa and the Arabic states. And from Europe, Professor Dame Caroline Dean, who was from England. From North America, Professor Janet Rissant. Latin America, Professor Amy Austin. And the Asia Pacific, Professor Mi-Han Shang, who's a woman of about 82 years old and is actually a paleontologist of great repute, having dug up the China Sea and discovered fossils which showed how these fish adapted and modified their lives, grew arms and legs, and modified life on terra firma.
Thank you. Just interrupt you there. Can you just give us a quick background, your daughter, where she studied and where she got the professorship?
Okay. She was at Wits. She was very always enormously concerned with children and setting up clinics and so on. Was even at Wits getting awards for setting up community clinic, and then after Wits she did her housemanship and went overseas, and then landed up at doing a specialization in pediatrics and in pulmonology, and then was at Columbia University. While there she met her husband, who's also a professor, very, very well-known Professor Dan Stein of psychiatry. He's head of psychiatry at UCT, and Heather at UCT, and also at Red Cross Memorial Hospital, and also head of their whole scientific research department. So after her first baby, she wanted to be back with the family and granny and so on, and little Jewish granddaughter now came back to South Africa and went to work at Red Cross Hospital. And if I can say, one of the best compliments I ever had about her was the late Morris Kibble, who was professor of pediatrics at Red Cross, saying to me, "Your daughter's a pain in the ass. I have to keep on revising my set works and the books on pediatrics because she keeps on making new inventions and new breakthroughs." And I think while working at Red Cross, she became very, very conscious of the mortality rate of babies dying of asthma, of TB, and started to work and to research better methodologies and how to save the thousands of children who were dying. And because of that, she invented new methods of diagnostic methods, and one is of treating asthma using a recycled plastic bottle, like a Coke bottle, which is used throughout Africa today.
We're taking a break. We'll be back in a few moments. Welcome back. This program, Around and About, is with the compliments of Maxie's Discount Butchery. Maxie's on the Strip in Glen Hazel, for the finest service from Maxie Class, Trevor Weiner, Warren Class, and from Celia Stein. This week's specials: raisin rib 140 Rand per kilo, blade steak 115 per kilo, boerewors 79 Rand per kilo, roast beef 195 Rand per kilo. So you can contact Maxie's on 011 485 1485, or you can send them an email, maxiesdiscount@mweb.wcoza. So Shirley, welcome back, and let's hear more about this wonderful, wonderful daughter of yours.
Well, I'm not going to talk about her, but I'm going to talk about the awards. First of all, the UNESCO building, very famous building, done by Marcel Breuer and the engineer Nervi in the mid-1950s, and endowed with Picasso's and Henry Moore. It's really an architectural, well, it's a really high for me to have gone there and seen the building, besides, of course, all the most incredible architecture and sights of Paris. I must just mention that Jewish Paris itself was so exciting and interesting, And one of the celebratory, or one of the, they had sorry, can I just stop a sec?
We'll come back to you. We have what we call senior moments.
Yeah, a senior moment. One of the conferences that they had was at Rothschild Villa, and you know the Rothschilds. There were 5 sons in the banking empire of Europe, and especially in Paris, in France, how they paid for the whole of the rail network, and there's the Rothschild Hospital. And this particular session was held at one of the old palaces of the Rothschilds, most incredible building. Now, besides, I must just mention the Marais area, which is the old Jewish area where there's the Pletzel, which was the sort of central place in the Marais area, and still there are all the kosher delicatessens and the best pita and hummus and all these shops which are kosher within the Marais area. It was originally a very wealthy palatial area, and then after the French Revolution, you know, the Jews came in, a lot of immigrant Jews, and it became the center of Jewish life. At present, there are about 500,000 Jews in France, half of which live in Paris. It's a great drop from the beginning of the 2000s. I think there has been enormous amount of immigration, an aliyah to Israel. And, well, that's another subject, but very close in the hearts of Paris is the 2015, November the 13th, I think, 2015, the ISIS attacks. And although those specific attacks weren't targeting Jews, I think Jews, there is a huge Muslim community in Paris. I think the Muslim and the Jewish communities are the major communities there, and I think was a degree of unease. The actual presentation, the night of the presentation, the head of UNESCO, whose name is Mrs. Audrey Azoulay, she had been the Minister of Science and Culture in France, and she's now the Director General of the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. She gave the major award, and she was accompanied by Jean-Paul Agon, who was the chairman and the chief executive officer of L'Oréal, who's the chairman of L'Oréal Foundation, who pour fortunes into this award and make it a really international, worldwide event. So if I just can mention the 5 recipients, because each one on their own was phenomenal. The L'Oréal Foundation had sent a film crew to each of the recipients' homeland, and they had made a film on the work they were doing. And I know in the case of my daughter, they followed her around for a couple of days, and they were overawed at Cape Town, and a lot of the movie had to do with Table Mountain and the gorgeous sights, but also the work that she was doing in the clinics and in the hospital. So the first one, Professor Caroline Dean, she's a dame of the British Empire. She spoke, her field is epigenetics, and a lot of the research that is being done today has to do with the manipulating of genes, how you can control, let's say, hereditary disease, and how you can switch on and off certain genes. So she spoke at length. And then there was Professor Janet Rossant, who was from the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, Canada, and her scientific research also dealt with genetics and dealt with the war on disease is huge in the scientific community, and it also had to do with how you can use stem cells, and she showed some of her slides where they had created in the laboratory baby frogs. I mean, it was really like the new age. And there was Professor Amy Austin from Argentina, and she had looked at the ecosystem and what they called surviving the Anthropocene, which is the age where you've got climate change and adaptation and the carbon emissions, and she spoke about how one had to modify and adapt to that. And then there was this marvelous woman, Professor Mi Mao Chung, on a paleontologist. But interestingly enough, the L'Oreal UNESCO organization, they actually sponsor emerging scientific talents, and they had invited these people to come to Paris for this most wonderful event. And these young women had set up displays of the work they were doing, one of which was actually a South African representing again Africa and the Arab states, and that was a young woman by the name of, just let me think, she is doing research on melanoma and using plant extracts, or trying to her name was Danielle Twilly from Pretoria, and she was using science, she's in plant science, in order to try and control growth of melanoma. Then there was this young Japanese woman, Dr. Radha Boya, who was, an Indian lady who actually was an expert in water desalination. She's actually a materials engineer and had discovered that by using thin pipes with some specific material within it, the salt would be attracted to the material and the water would flow through. But the Japanese woman, Dr. Yuka Agawa, was dressed in traditional Japanese clothes. She looked like a young geisha girl. And then, to my amazement, she actually is a materials engineer, and her research was in structural materials. So you had a whole gamut of different research of people. Included were some of the real recipients in previous years, in the 20 previous years of this award, who had come to Paris and who also were available. Some gave some presentation, but you could speak to them, and meeting them was just one of the greatest pleasures.
Now, Shirley, you're an architect by profession, and of course you were in Paris. Tell me your impressions of the architecture in Paris, particularly the Eiffel Tower where you were.
Isaac, I was overwhelmed. It was really my first exposure to Paris, and we lived in a little, my daughter had taken a little flat just overlooking the Louvre in the center, close to the Seine and close to all the really the Notre Dame and all the most wonderful buildings that I taught about in architecture but had never really seen. Of course, the Eiffel Tower is just, one cannot imagine how significant that is. In fact, I mean, it's 324 meters high. One doesn't actually realize the scale of it when you look at the pictures. don't forget when it was built for the Universal Exhibition in 1889, it was the tallest building in the whole world. That's before the New York Empire State Building had been built in 31. And also there were so many innovations like the double-decker lifts to get to the top. Now the Eiffel Tower is truly the symbol of Paris and you see it from everywhere. But some of the other buildings that fascinated me no end was the Pompidou Centre, which is a modern museum. It's the Muséum National d'Art Moderne, and there were Chagalls there and Matisses and Brock's, and surprisingly enough they had a visiting exhibition of Sidney Goldblatt, our own Sidney Goldblatt, photographer of the mines and the mining. I just want to mention one last building, which was La Fondation Louis Vuitton, and that is one of the most extraordinary buildings in the world, done by the architect Gehry.
It's a pity you didn't go to the Baron Rothschild synagogue.
I would have gone, but two of my daughters who had come also to this wonderful event were Shomrei Shabbat, and it was too far for us to walk. And don't forget, it was a rainy, little bit cold Paris, although at the event, if you saw the strapless dresses and that, you wouldn't have believed it.
I think you had a most wonderful experience, and of course you must be very, very proud of your daughter. And please God, I hope to interview her when in a few weeks' time. And you also mentioned about all the billboards with you.
Yeah, well, if you arrive in the Paris airport and you see your daughter huge on the billboard, it gives you a shock. And also in Beijing, on all the billboards, all 5 of the recipients it is such a huge event. Well, in Paris it is enormous with the TV, and I think it was just also a huge pride that here was a young Jewish girl getting this world.
Shirley, I want to wish you lots of mazel and Nick, and please God, we'll have some more good news from your daughter. Thank you for coming in. It's been an absolute pleasure. Wish you well. And of course, you and I have been close friends for many years. We're always discussing past history, present history. And there's a lovely photograph there of your daughter. Just show it to Ilan. And
yeah, Ilan, have a look. That was on the billboard. The billboards of her treating a baby with that inhaler, which is a Coke bottle.
A Coke bottle, she should be paid a royalty by Coca-Cola.
Well, plenty of
should make a fortune. So it's been an absolute pleasure having you. I want to thank Ilan for controlling. And as I said, we're going to have Hugh Reichland coming in, and of course the passing of Ronnie Raff. You live across the road from the Raffs. You're number 90, they're 89 Avondale Street.
Very sad.
And it was a very, very sad. He was ill for, not even for 2 or 3 years, I think, and he was in and out of hospital. A wonderful family. I know the family. I go back with his grandfather. When I saw the grandchildren, I told them about their great-grandfather. In Jeppe, there was a hotel called the Grand Station Hotel.
Yes.
And their grandfather had the Grand Station hairdressers. And his name was Reuben Raff. His wife's name was Simmer. She lived to 100. She lived at the Connoisseur Hotel. And when they lived, then they moved to Cyril Dean. And Mrs. Raff, Simmer Raff, would take a bus every day from Cyril Dean, Derrick Avenue, to the centre of town, and then from town take a tram to Jeppe, to the Grand Station Hotel, which was in John Page Drive. I'm sure that brings back memories.
We all remember that.
She would make him a hot meal wrapped in cloth and stay with him the whole afternoon. And then both of them would then take a bus back, a tram back, and a bus back to Cyril Dean. And she did that for years and years and years. The most wonderful, wonderful family. There was an uncle also who had a hairdresser. It was called Lancet Hall in Jetty Street.
Yeah.
Also he had a hairdresser there. And of course, later on his parents and the other brothers, they were all involved in this motor industry in Benoni, where they sold spare parts. But that's for another time. But I just wanted to mention that to you.
It's a beautiful story.
Now, if you remember, surely the Grand Station Hotel,
yes,
it was very, very popular in those days.
Yeah.
Because the Havdil, and I'm not saying it, they used to serve, well, I wouldn't,
yes.
They used to say the best prawns
yes.
in Johannesburg. And all the businessmen would
like
come.
50 years ago, it was at its peak.
Yes. It was at its peak.
Yes.
And everybody would come from all over Johannesburg just to come to the Grand Station.
They weren't
Hotel.
Coming to Wachenheim.
No.
It was in Bate Street, then they were going
They would
the
go
Grand.
to the Grand Station. The owner was a guy called Mr. Geffen.
That's right.
Right, remember him.
Yeah.
And the man who ran the bar, he was a world famous South African boxer called Tommy Bench. I remember him, I can just picture him. And because we used to go for our haircut to Mr. Raff Senior. And it was Norman Gaffin who ran the Grand Station Hotel.
Well, I think it was the days when Jeppy and the Jeppy Shul.
Yes, well,
really
in its heyday.
Heyday. Yes.
And don't forget, they just converted there used to be a subway in Jeppy.
Yes.
And then they changed it, and the trains used to go underneath.
Right.
That's why it was called, I was articled my pharmacy to Jeppy Subway Pharmacy. Because
really?
it was
Right
it was a subway then. So
now the
that's
shul
history.
was designed by Margot.
Yes.
And having looked at the plans, it was quite well. It had wonderful details and many.
Are you talking about the
things.
new shul?
Yeah,
Yeah,
the new, on the oval.
on the oval. Yes,
Yeah,
I've got pictures here. I'll show you.
Yeah.
1923 it was built.
Yeah.
And the shul was based very similar to the Great
Okay.
Synagogue, and the furniture came originally from the old Witwatersrand Hebrew congregation. I've got photographs here I'll show you in a few moments. And that's the history of that.
I think the shul, the building still exists.
Buildings there, it was
Yeah,
sold, it's
on the
now a
oval,
church.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
But the original Jeppy shul, built in 1903.
On the railway line.
On the railway
Yeah.
line, and that property was bought by the Lubners, and where they had plate glass and Beverly.
Yeah.
So look, that's history.
It's history.
We'll go
Well,
back.
I love
So I just
that
want
history.
to thank Ilan for controlling. And,
Thank you, Ilan.
And for having you. And Hugh Reichland will be in a few moments. Now, this program you can listen to a little later on, surely, at about 6 o'clock. You get onto the www, we'll show you, and it'll be on YouTube and on Mixcloud. Thanks for listening.
Thank
Go
you.
well.